Let's get seated and we'll start the session. Let me take this opportunity to welcome you all to this 10th roundtable session on financing water, the regional meeting on Africa, which is a hybrid session as we have participants also joining us online. My name is Mchera Chirwa. I'm the coordinator for the African Water Facility in the African Development Bank, and I'm honored to be your moderator for this morning session. We are honored to have His Excellency, the Minister of Water and Sanitation in the Republic of Senegal, His Excellency Mr. Serine Baye-Thiam, who will make a keynote address this morning. But before that, we will have two other speakers whom I will introduce, and also a short video. Our morning session will have the opening with the 4 speakers, including the Honorable Minister. This will be followed up by 3 other speakers as part of setting the scene for our agenda over the next 2 days. Just as a way of a quick background, the Roundtable on Financing Water is a public-private initiative that was established by the OECD in partnership with the Government of Netherlands, the World Water Council, and the World Bank in 2017. It organizes a number of these roundtables set up to discuss particular themes relating to financing water, but also regional events globally. And the idea is to bring together public and private partners, political leadership, water experts, technical experts, financiers, and private sector to discuss issues relating to the development of water and sanitation globally. In this particular roundtable, the 10th of its kind, the focus is on Africa. And the African Development Bank is delighted to co-organize this event with the OECD and the other partners. I will now move into the opening session, the speakers, and delighted to invite our first speaker, who is Mr. Walid Uslati. Mr. Uslati is the head of the Climate, Biodiversity, and Water Division at the OECD Environment Department. Mr. Uslati, please, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Mesdames et messieurs, Votre Excellence, Monsieur le Ministre, je vais faire ma petite introduction en anglais. Donc, it's my great pleasure to officially launch the 10th meeting of the Roundtable on Financing Water. I'm delighted to welcome a wide range of representatives and leaders from the water and finance communities, including governments, water utilities, public and private investors, development banks, international organizations, NGOs, and others, from all over Africa and also other parts of the world, to discuss these critical issues of better financing water in Africa. Let me first give you some background on the Roundtable on Financing Water. Since its inception in 2017, the Roundtable here has raised the profile of water financing internationally, identified ways to overcome investment barriers in water, challenged traditional financing approaches, and promoted innovative water-related investment strategies. The Roundtable has made major contributions to identify and fill gaps in quantitative and qualitative research on a series of issues on financing water at the global and regional levels. In the past, the Roundtable has met to discuss specific themes such as agricultural water, water and climate, and regions, including Africa in partnership with the Asian Development Bank, Europe with the European Investment Bank, and North America with the Inter-American Development Bank. Early in 2023, the ninth, the previous roundtable on financing water, was stepping stone towards the UN 2023 water conference, and contributed to a finance perspective to the water action agenda. So this roundtable is particularly timely. 7 years ahead of the deadline of the 2030 agenda, the world is not on track to achieve the SDG 6 on water and sanitation, largely due to insufficient investment level. In Africa, the challenges are particularly acute. A significant portion of the population still does not have access to safely managed drinking water and sanitation. And this lack of access has considerable social and economic consequences. It comes with a cost for the society. Under a business as usual scenario, the Sahel and Central Africa are projected to experience a negative GDP impacts, according to the World Bank, that could go from 12% to 7% respectively. 12 and 7% respectively by 2050 because of climate change effects on water resources. Despite the strong economic case to invest in water security, and investment levels in water in Africa are inadequate. Achieving SDG 6 by 2030 in Africa would require increase in rates of progress by 12 for safely managed drinking water, 20 for safely managed sanitation, and 42 for basic hygiene services. At the same time, the macroeconomic and financial situation is extremely challenging, and official development assistance in Africa is decreasing. That's really a big challenge regarding the water situation and all the implication for the society and for the international economy overall. In this context, it's time for leaders and experts from the water and finance communities to sit together and find bold solutions. To this end, the sessions in this roundtable, the 10th roundtable, will cover very timely and relevant topics on financing water in Africa, such as investing in water for growth and sustainable development, the untapped power of regional and national development banks, opportunities and limits of leveraging private finance, the value of water and biodiversity in Africa for global economies, water-related risks and implications for financial institutions, as well as financing sanitation. In addition, the side event of African Union Commission, the African Union Development Agency, and the International High-Level Panel on Water Investments in Africa will present the first time the High-Level Panel Investment Action Plan, and will showcase investment opportunities under the water portfolio of the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa. The side event, organized by the Global Water Intelligence and the 300 Water Leaders Initiative, will look at ways of using finance to overcome the challenges facing water utilities in Africa. I would like to reiterate the importance of the partnership between the OECD and the African Development Bank. At the OECD meeting of the Council at ministerial level last June last year, and in the presence of President of Senegal at that time, chairperson of the African Union, Her Excellency Mr. Macky Sall, the OECD committed to deepening its engagement with Africa based on openness, inclusiveness, trust, and mutual learning, including through consultation on a new OECD Africa partnership. We are rationalizing commitment by co-convening this regional meeting on financing water in Africa. This partnership was enclosed by the Secretary General of the OECD, Matthias Cormann, and the President of the African Development Bank, Mr. Adesina, in an exchange of letters in 2022. Since then, our teams worked closely to organize the roundtable, set up a robust agenda, and to deliver evidence-based and impactful analysis on financing water in Africa. Before we begin, I would like to share a few housekeeping rules. So tea, coffee, and lunch will be provided to participants. Translation services will be available in English and in French so that everyone can participate actively in the dialogue. Each session has been designed to allow some for discussion with the audience. Your views are not only welcome, they are really essential. For those joining us online, please feel free to use the Q&A function to ask questions. Please join each session 10 minutes in advance so that we can make sure we start on time. Last but not least, I would like to warmly thank the Roundtable funding members, the government of the Netherlands, the World Water Council, and the World Bank for their guidance and support, as well as our co-convener, the African Development Bank, for the hard work and very fruitful collaboration. Without your support, this event could not have happened, and I'm deeply grateful for this. I would like also to thank again any of you for participating to this roundtable meeting, either in person or online. Your leadership expertise is much needed. I look forward to exchanging with you all during this 2 days. I wish you a productive, insightful roundtable meeting and deeply appreciate your attention and commitment. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Walid. I will now request our director, Mr. Oswald Chanda, is the Director for Water and Sanitation Development at the African Development Bank, to make his remarks, which he will do virtually online. I believe, Oswald, you are online?
Yes, please.
Thank you. I hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Mchera, for this opportunity and time. Your Excellency, Serine Mbaye Thiam, Minister of Water and Sanitation of Senegal, we are very grateful that you could take time to come and join us and give it the impetus, give it the status that this roundtable deserves. We are truly grateful. Walid Weslati, Head of the Climate, Biodiversity and Water Division at OECD, my friend, we have talked. We were at your offices not too long ago, and you You said you were coming. You kept your word, and I think it's important that we show this strong partnership. Fatuma Toure Ibrahim Wen, Global Practice Manager for West Africa World Bank. We should do more of this, work together for the good of Africa. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, please, please allow me to render my sincere apologies for not being with you there physically. This was due to circumstances well beyond my control, but I made a commitment that at least we will speak. The 10th Roundtable on Financing Water provides an opportunity for partners to refine and share knowledge of water financing needs and capacities in Africa. And it provides an important platform to mobilize regional actors around shared issues or lines of action. This is very important for us to do this, and we need to do this a lot more regularly here on the continent. The Roundtable builds on the UN 2023 Water Conference, which recognized financing as a central topic. The conference recognized that developing countries need better access to financing, that unstable financing instruments, practices need to be reconfigured to support people and the environment now and in the future. We cannot talk financing today without making reference to the impact of climate change, the impact of what is happening globally. The Sustainable Development 6, which is to ensure availability and sustainable management of water and sanitation for all, also has spillover effects on food security, health lives, energies, sustainable cities, sustainable consumption and production, and marine and terrestrial ecosystem. Therefore, without enough water at the right time, in the right quantities, there can be no sustainable development, including security, food, and energy access. This we have evidence of. While there has been progress, there is still much to be accomplished. In Africa, we have heard the numbers: 447 million people do not have access to at least basic water supply services. Double that number, 805 million lack access to at least basic sanitation services. This must make us uncomfortable. This must make us not to sleep, but to think about how best to address this challenge. These losses, as a result of these low numbers in diseases, floods, crop failure, can be prevented with better and more investment, efficient, inclusive, and nature-based water systems. We can tackle these problems. Although irrigation in Africa has the potential to boost agriculture productivity by at least 50%, food production is largely rain-fed. The area equipped for irrigation, which is estimated at 13 million hectares, makes up just 6% of what the potential of cultivated land that could be irrigated. It's vast, it's huge. The population growth, rapid urbanization, agricultural demands, climate change, especially climate-related natural disasters like floods, amplify these challenges, and about 99% of the people impacted by natural disasters experience water-related distress. Meanwhile, climate finance only covers a fraction of the adaptation costs needed in climate-exposed regions. Therefore, achieving SDGs demands unprecedented mobilization of resources. However, the water sector is chronically underinvested, with current levels of investment estimated at a paltry 0.5% of the GDP on average. For sub-Saharan Africa, expenditures required to reach universal access to water supply and sanitation services alone are as high as 4% of the GDP. But we're talking about 0.5% currently. To cater for project preparation, investment finance, and risk mitigation. However, public sources of finance alone cannot close this gap between the investment needs and available resources. The private sector needs to come in. And we know that globally, 9% of the investments, basically water assets in developing countries, comes from a private sector, versus 87% in telecoms and 45% in the power sector coming from the private. Public funds, yes, they are a significant source of investment, but for future funding is not adequate. It needs to be a lot more systematic. Without unified planning, the water and sanitation sector is going to be continually perceived as a higher risk sector for the private capital. So public financing is critical in setting the foundation to attract the private capital. While bridging the financing gap requires expanded utilization of private finance successfully. Leveraging this finance requires credit-worthy water and sanitation service providers and a strong governance system. And not just a strong governance system, one that is reliable, one that is credible, one that is consistent. The absence of robust national water strategies, the poor financial health of utilities, the lack of bankable projects, stable regulations, and where needed, concessional finance and guarantees also limits private sector participation and access to domestic commercial financing. The good news is that the water sector is increasingly receiving attention from both the public, the private, the domestic commercial finance, and philanthropic investors in line with the 2015 Addis Ababa Action Agenda. It is therefore possible to unlock private finance by accelerating reforms, addressing the creditworthiness of utilities, designing bankable projects, and developing innovative financing instruments. It's also incumbent upon governments to improve the sector prioritization and increase the amounts of public funding made available to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal 6. The public sector can support the water sector in maximizing the needed financing. This support can range from raising new funds through increasing revenues from tariffs and other service fees, reducing costs through efficiency improvements, increasing fiscal budget allocations, increasing access grants from available trust funds resources, issuing green bonds, contingent financing that is tailored to the water sector, and providing guarantees or loans financing that is concessional or semi-concessional. But the greatest of this is increasing the efficiency in utilities, increasing the governance in the water sector. It's going to help in doubling the resources that are available to the sector. The public sector can also enhance access to mitigation carbon financing. The water sector contributes to greenhouse gases emissions, presenting opportunities for mitigation investments. Global Water Intelligence estimates emissions from water supply, wastewater sludge, and on-site sanitation at 847 million tons carbon emission per year. Of this, water supply accounts for 38%, wastewater and sanitation accounts for 30%, and on-site sanitation makes up the remaining 32% due to entirely emissions of methane. Information sharing needs to take place for lenders to assess and formulate mechanisms to manage risks. The creation of market intelligence, risk assessment tools such as credit rating, creditworthiness indices, and benchmarking instruments can help in improving, rendering the understanding on the financial and technical health of utilities and enhance the comfort that is so much needed by the private sector. This calls for development partners, governments, philanthropies, multilateral development banks, development finance institutions, project developers, entrepreneurs, incubators, everyone, civil society, to be engaged, to be involved, to accelerate, scale, and optimize the much needed investments in this sector. So let's all rally together and get the much needed investments on the continent, especially in sub-Saharan Africa, so that we can make progress towards the Sustainable Development Goal 6. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Oswald, for that inspiring statement and remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my honor to invite His Excellency, the Honorable Minister from Senegal, His Excellency Mr. Serine Mbaye Thiam, to give us his keynote address. Monsieur le Ministre, vous avez la parole.
Merci beaucoup, M. Michel Johannes Chirois, qui assure cette modération. Je voudrais saluer M. Walid Oueles Tali, avec qui je partage le panel et cette cérémonie d'ouverture, ainsi que Oswald Chanda, qui vient de nous délivrer son message. Saluer aussi Mme Fatouma Touré Ibrahim Wan, responsable pour l'Afrique de l'Ouest de la Banque mondiale, chez Niels Vlaanderen des Pays-Bas et Mme Yvonne Mangaya de l'Association des régulateurs ESAWAS. Mesdames, Messieurs, chers participants, je voudrais vous saluer tous. Je félicite et remercie la Banque africaine de développement et l'OCDE d'avoir co-organisé cette 10e table ronde sur le financement de l'eau et d'y avoir associé le Sénégal. Je félicite également les partenaires de cet événement que sont le gouvernement des Pays-Bas, le Conseil mondial de l'eau et la Banque mondiale. Le Sénégal est honoré de l'invitation à prononcer un message à l'occasion de l'ouverture de cette réunion régionale importante. Comme vous le savez, la question de l'eau est l'une des plus déterminantes de notre époque et conditionne dans une large mesure la sécurité et le développement. Elle est fondamentale dans nos vies et nos moyens de subsistance. Alors qu'elle devrait être le moteur du développement durable, l'eau devient au contraire de plus en plus un obstacle à la croissance économique, à la sécurité énergétique et alimentaire, au bien-être, à la santé et à l'environnement. D'après les prévisions, en 2025, 1,8 milliard de personnes pourraient vivre dans des pays ou régions touchés par une pénurie d'eau complète et les 2 tiers de la population mondiale pourraient se trouver dans des conditions de stress hydrique. Même si des avancées significatives ont été réalisées dans beaucoup de pays, force est de constater qu'il existe encore des progrès importants à accomplir, notamment en Afrique, où 400 millions de personnes n'ont pas accès à l'eau potable et 700 millions n'ont pas accès à des services d'assainissement de base. Le rapport 2023 sur la mise en œuvre de l'ODD 6, intitulé Blueprint, révèle que le monde n'est toujours pas sur la bonne voie pour atteindre l'objectif numéro 6 à l'horizon 2030. Le rapport souligne également que pour parvenir à une couverture universelle d'ici 2030, il faudra multiplier par 6 les taux actuels de progrès dans le domaine de l'eau potable, multiplier par 5 le taux actuel de progrès dans le domaine de l'assainissement et multiplier par 3 le taux actuel de progrès dans le domaine de l'hygiène. Nous devons le faire parce que le coût de l'inaction est trop élevé. Près de 20 milliards de dollars américains sont perdus chaque année en raison des problèmes liés à l'eau et à l'assainissement sur le continent africain. Mais aussi parce qu'investir dans la sécurité de l'eau à l'échelle du continent est une occasion de catalyser la croissance et la prospérité. Chaque dollar américain investi dans l'eau et l'assainissement rapporte au moins 7 dollars américains en gain pour la société, qu'il s'agisse de l'impact sur la santé ou sur la croissance économique. À cet égard, il est important de souligner que les investissements dans l'eau sont vitaux pour tous les secteurs de la vie. Ils sont aussi essentiels pour rendre performante l'économie des pays africains et assurer une croissance soutenue. Ainsi, dans un contexte macroéconomique et financier très difficile, marqué par la baisse de l'aide publique au développement, les défis pour le financement de l'eau s'accentuent en Afrique. À 7 ans de l'échéance de l'agenda 2030 des ODD, nous devons agir vite et ensemble pour mobiliser et sécuriser les financements essentiels au développement du secteur de l'eau et de l'assainissement en Afrique, où, d'après les estimations, au moins 30 milliards de dollars US doivent être investis chaque année pour atteindre la cible de l'ODD 6 relative à l'eau et à l'assainissement. Actuellement, seuls 10 à 19 milliards de dollars sont investis chaque année. Mais avant tout, nous devons d'abord commencer par nous rendre à l'évidence que face aux faibles résultats enregistrés dans le recours au seul mécanisme de financement traditionnel, mécanisme de financement dans lequel les pays n'allouent aujourd'hui que 0,5% de leur PIB au secteur. L'heure est venue pour que les acteurs de l'eau travaillent à la promotion d'approches innovantes de financement. L'investissement public et privé, ainsi que les partenariats publics et privés, jouent un rôle crucial pour répondre aux besoins financiers croissants dans le secteur de l'eau en Afrique, afin d'assurer un accès durable à l'eau et à des services d'assainissement de qualité pour tous. Ce constat, peu reluisant, m'amène à souligner la pertinence de cette table ronde sur le financement de l'eau qui nous réunira durant ces 2 jours ici à Abidjan. Mesdames, Messieurs, l'atteinte de l'ODD 6 est une étape cruciale vers un avenir durable et sûr pour tous. Il n'y aura pas de développement durable des économies africaines sans investissement massif et efficace dans l'eau. Le développement de mécanismes financiers novateurs tels que les obligations vertes, les fonds d'investissement spécifiques à l'eau et à l'assainissement, les instruments de titrisation ou les partenariats avec des institutions financières peuvent attirer des investissements privés. Pour y parvenir, il est plus qu'urgent que les États mettent en place des fonds de garantie gouvernementale pour réduire les risques d'investissement, mettre en place des assurances et des mécanismes de partage des risques pour encourager la participation du secteur privé. Il s'agira de créer un cadre attractif et favorable à l'investissement privé. Mais le premier des éléments pour ce cadre attractif et favorable, c'est d'avoir des institutions solides, un cadre juridique qui permet à l'investissement privé d'avoir une visibilité sur les risques. Et ça relève aussi des gouvernements. À cet égard, il est important de souligner que le Sénégal fait partie des pays qui, en Afrique, ont su réaliser des avancées probantes dans la construction d'infrastructures hydrauliques qui se reflètent sur les taux d'accès à l'eau et à l'assainissement dans notre pays. Au cours de la dernière décennie, le gouvernement du Sénégal a démontré un engagement constant dans la mobilisation des financements dans le secteur de l'eau. Plusieurs initiatives et stratégies ont été mises en place pour garantir l'accès et la gestion durable des ressources en eau dans le pays, à travers notamment la construction de nouveaux systèmes d'approvisionnement en eau potable, la réhabilitation et l'extension des réseaux d'approvisionnement, la construction en cours d'unités de dessalement de l'eau de mer, ainsi que des projets d'assainissement pour répondre aux besoins croissants de la population. Le Sénégal a également encouragé les partenariats publics-privés pour attirer des investissements dans le secteur de l'eau et bénéficier de soutien financier et technique de la part d'institutions internationales. Au titre de ces partenariats publics-privés, je voudrais citer l'initiative qu'on avait prise en 1996 de scinder le secteur de l'assainissement en deux, une société de patrimoine, la Société nationale des eaux du Sénégal qui s'occupe des investissements, et une société d'exploitation qui était une société d'affermage qui avait un contrat, qui a exécuté un contrat de 23 ans pour la gestion de l'eau au titre de l'État du Sénégal, qui a donné des succès et qui a permis d'améliorer tant les taux d'accès en milieu urbain que la qualité du service de l'eau. Et ce contrat a été renouvelé en 2020 sur la base d'un appel d'offres avec un nouvel opérateur qui va gérer le service de l'eau pendant 15 ans en milieu urbain. Cette expérience réussie en milieu urbain nous a incité à répliquer ça en 2014 dans le milieu rural, où cette fois-ci le territoire a été divisé en 8 délégations de services publics pour la gestion de l'eau en milieu rural. Et sur la base d'appels d'offres, il y a des opérateurs qui interviennent aujourd'hui en milieu rural. Et ces délégations de services publics permettent à l'État de se concentrer sur les investissements structurants et laisse tout ce qui est réseau de distribution et de gestion de l'eau à des opérateurs privés. La même expérience aussi a été tentée dans le domaine de l'assainissement, où pour la gestion des stations de bout de vidange pour l'assainissement autonome, là aussi, depuis quelques années, nous avons signé des contrats avec des délégataires de services publics. Et il est heureux de constater que lorsque l'organisme étatique, qui est l'Office national de l'assainissement, gérait ces stations de bout de vidange, il perdait de l'argent. Et lorsque ce sont les privés qui gèrent ces stations de bout de vidange, par la valorisation de ces sous-produits de l'assainissement, verse des redevances à l'Office national d'assainissement qui en perdait lorsque lui-même gérait ces stations de bout de vidange. C'est ce qui nous encourage aujourd'hui à réfléchir aussi sur la prochaine étape dans l'assainissement. Nous avons une feuille de route sur laquelle nous travaillons pour voir comment intégrer le secteur privé dans le secteur de l'assainissement. Et c'est la même approche que nous avons aujourd'hui pour la deuxième unité de dessalement de 300 000 m3 extensible à 400 000 m3 sur laquelle nous sommes en train de travailler avec un partenaire privé pour pouvoir dupliquer ce que nous avons fait dans le domaine de l'énergie avec les IPP, les producteurs indépendants d'eau. Si nous pouvons avoir des IWP, des producteurs indépendants, où en ce moment-là, c'est eux qui prennent le risque de l'investissement et l'État garantit sur la base d'un prix d'achat au mètre cube la rentabilité de l'affaire. Et c'est la même approche que nous avons pour le prochain grand transfert d'eau que nous envisageons de faire pour alimenter Dakar. Le financement de l'eau mérite donc des initiatives de très haut niveau, au même titre que le Fonds vert pour le climat et d'autres mécanismes de financement. Il est aujourd'hui plus qu'urgent de mobiliser des partenariats et les financements pour combler le déficit d'investissement dans le secteur de l'eau en Afrique. L'idée d'un fonds bleu pour l'eau avait été proposée par le Sénégal en 2016 pour contribuer à résorber le gap et à booster l'accès inclusif à des services sécurisés d'eau et d'assainissement. Et dans le souci de donner l'exemple, l'initiative Fonds bleu du Sénégal a été confiée au Fonds national souverain d'investissement stratégique, le Fonds 6, qui sera une première expérience de concrétisation de cette nouvelle approche pour tester et démontrer que le concept de financement innovant est basé sur le principe de mobilisation de ressources domestiques est tout à fait faisable. C'est également tout le sens de l'engagement du président de la République du Sénégal, son Excellence Macky Sall, qui a bien voulu lancer, lors du 9e Forum mondial de l'eau de Dakar, le panel international de haut niveau sur les investissements pour l'eau en Afrique, dont le but est de mobiliser des financements d'ici 2030 pour mettre en œuvre le programme africain d'investissement dans l'eau, afin de doter l'Afrique d'infrastructures de qualité pour assurer la sécurité de l'eau et la résilience climatique. La mobilisation de financements domestiques ainsi que les budgets des gouvernements africains sont essentiels. Le panel recommande une augmentation de 25% des financements d'ici 2030. Nous pouvons atteindre cet objectif. Les gouvernements africains fournissent déjà la majeure partie du financement de l'eau, avec plus de 60% des fonds alloués à l'eau provenant des budgets nationaux. Il est heureux de constater que l'agenda de cette table ronde, l'organisation d'un side event qui procédera à la validation technique du plan d'action pour l'investissement de l'eau en Afrique, qui sera lancé prochainement à la COP28 à Dubaï, aux Émirats arabes unis. En outre, la table ronde fera le suivi de la mise en œuvre des engagements africains dans le cadre du Water Action Agenda issu de la conférence des Nations Unies sur l'eau de mars 2023. Je saisis cette occasion pour lancer un appel aux partenaires et amis de l'Afrique, car il est impératif que nous fassions des progrès significatifs sur la gestion cruciale du financement des infrastructures pour l'eau dans notre continent, dont notre continent a tant besoin pour bâtir ses économies et sa résilience face au changement climatique. Concernant ce sujet stratégique du financement de l'eau, la feuille de route qui nous mène vers le 10e Forum mondial de l'eau de Bali 2024 pourrait s'adosser aussi et tirer parti du Blue Deal, qui est la déclaration de Dakar, le Blue Deal pour la sécurité de l'eau et de l'assainissement, pour la paix et le développement, issu du 9e Forum mondial de l'eau de Dakar, et qui, dans son axe 3, appelle à assurer des financements adéquats pour le secteur de l'eau et de l'assainissement. Je voudrais, pour finir, réitérer mes félicitations à toutes les parties prenantes pour leur rôle moteur dans l'organisation de cette réunion qui augure d'ores et déjà d'une table ronde de qualité dont les conclusions pourraient placer l'Afrique sur les rampes de l'accès universel à l'eau et à l'assainissement. Je vous remercie de votre écoute attentive et souhaite plein succès à vos travaux.
Merci beaucoup, Son Excellence, Monsieur le Ministre, pour ces mots très forts, très encourageants, pour nous mettre dans un espace pour penser comment améliorer, augmenter les services, provision de services en Afrique. Ladies and gentlemen, we have one more intervention as part of this opening session. That is a recorded message from the President of the World Water Council, Mr. Loic Fauchon. May I request the technical team to play the message? Thank you.
Chers amis de l'eau, chers collègues et amis d'Afrique, heureux de vous retrouver, même si c'est à travers un court message vidéo. Laissez-moi d'abord, au nom du Conseil mondial de l'eau, mais aussi en mon nom personnel, vous féliciter pour cet agenda à la fois passionnant et efficient. Et vous remercier. Merci de poursuivre nos travaux autour du financement de l'eau. Merci à l'OCDE, à la Banque mondiale, aussi à la Banque africaine de développement et au gouvernement des Pays-Bas. Je voudrais aussi saluer les membres du board du Conseil mondial de l'eau qui sont présents à Abidjan. Chers amis, le monde, notre monde, traverse tant de crises qui mettent l'humain en tension. L'eau est en souffrance et tous ceux qui en manquent le sont encore plus. L'évolution du climat et la croissance démographique, alliée à la concentration dans les mégacités, exacerbent cette crise de l'eau et perturbent les écosystèmes déjà fragiles. Les technologies, le digital, l'intelligence artificielle suscitent des avancées très encourageantes. Tout comme les transferts d'eau, l'exploitation raisonnée des eaux souterraines, le dessalement ou la réutilisation des eaux usées et d'autres encore. Mais l'innovation seule n'est pas suffisante. Des progrès sont indispensables en matière d'abord de gouvernance, pour déconcentrer, décentraliser les décisions dans le domaine de l'eau. Trouver le bon équilibre entre le rôle de l'État, celui des bassins et celui des autorités locales et des communautés locales, en même temps que mieux répartir. Chers amis de l'eau, chers collègues et amis d'Afrique, heureux de vous retrouver, même si c'est à travers un court message vidéo. Laissez-moi d'abord, au nom du Conseil mondial de l'eau, mais aussi en mon nom personnel, vous féliciter pour cet agenda à la fois passionnant et efficient. Et vous remercier de poursuivre nos travaux autour du financement de l'eau. Merci à l'OCDE, à la Banque mondiale, aussi à la Banque africaine de développement et au gouvernement des Pays-Bas. Je voudrais aussi saluer les membres du board du Conseil mondial de l'eau qui sont présents à Abidjan. Chers amis, le monde, notre monde, traverse tant de crises qui mettent l'humain en tension. L'eau est en souffrance et tous ceux qui en manquent le sont encore plus. L'évolution du climat et la croissance démographique, alliée à la concentration dans les mégacités, exacerbent cette crise de l'eau et perturbent les écosystèmes déjà fragiles. Les technologies, le digital, l'intelligence artificielle suscitent des avancées très encourageantes. Tout comme les transferts d'eau, l'exploitation raisonnée des eaux souterraines, le dessalement ou la réutilisation des eaux usées et d'autres encore. Mais l'innovation seule n'est pas suffisante. Des progrès sont indispensables en matière d'abord de gouvernance, pour déconcentrer, décentraliser les décisions dans le domaine de l'eau. Trouver le bon équilibre entre le rôle de l'État, celui des bassins et celui des autorités locales et des communautés locales, en même temps que mieux répartir les populations sur les territoires au plus près des ressources en eau. Et bien évidemment, il faut pouvoir financer. Financer l'investissement, bien sûr, mais aussi, et j'insiste par expérience personnelle, financer le fonctionnement, la maintenance, la formation, sont toujours des parents pauvres du système actuel, autant que peuvent aussi malheureusement l'être l'assainissement et le pluvial par rapport à l'eau et à sa sécurisation. L'eau manque d'argent, nous dit-on, et l'argent manque d'eau, ajoute-t-on. Les deux sont vrais. Et il faut mettre cette affirmation en parallèle avec ce merveilleux proverbe africain qui dit qu'il faut tout un village pour élever un enfant. Je crois qu'il en est de même pour nous. Il ne faut pas seulement un village pour sauver l'eau, mais tout un monde. Sécuriser les financements, oui, en les rendant plus innovants et plus diversifiés. Disons que, comme pour l'eau, il convient de produire plus de volume de financement tout en les gérant mieux. Ça signifie attirer de nouveaux capitaux, publics et privés, en rassurant les investisseurs, publics et privés, en atténuant les risques perçus ou réels. Je voudrais ici très rapidement énoncer quelques propositions dont certaines peut-être vous sembleront familières, puisque ce sont celles que j'ai évoquées à l'ouverture du 9e Forum mondial de l'eau à Dakar en mars 2022. D'abord, il s'agit de la question de la dette, pour sortir du piège de la dette. Nous demandons l'annulation de la dette de l'eau pour les États et les collectivités les plus pauvres. En effet, la dette menace de créer une urgence mondiale supplémentaire en matière de développement, de la même manière que la pandémie avait aggravé l'état des économies des pays déjà fragilisés. Nous proposons également d'encourager les gouvernements nationaux à établir des principes de sous-souveraineté, et ça dans le cadre de la déconcentration ou de la décentralisation, afin de donner aux autorités locales et régionales la possibilité, la capacité et le pouvoir d'aller sur les marchés internationaux pour des prêts liés à l'eau. Et puis enfin, nous aimerions proposer un mécanisme ou un standard concernant le financement de projets liés à l'eau, qui valoriserait davantage les projets qui vont au-delà du simple accès à l'eau. En effet, investir dans l'eau aura des impacts positifs et vertueux sur de nombreux aspects, l'alimentation, la santé, l'éducation, et permettre aussi des avancées sur le droit à l'eau. Je voudrais profiter de cette occasion pour mentionner et rappeler que nous sommes maintenant sur la voie du 10e forum mondial de l'eau qui se tiendra en mai 2024, en mai prochain, à Bali, en Indonésie. Pour ce 10e forum, nous avons choisi une devise simple: préserver l'eau pour une prospérité partagée. L'obligation d'atteindre l'abondance, la paix et la sérénité par le partage. Mais pour partager, il faut posséder, protéger, sauvegarder et respecter. Pendant la semaine du forum, les chefs d'État et de gouvernement, les décideurs politiques, les organisations internationales, les experts, les universitaires, les représentants de la société civile, les entrepreneurs du monde entier, viendront partager leurs connaissances, leurs expériences et leurs pratiques sur un large éventail de sujets liés à l'eau. Je vous invite à nous rejoindre sur la route de Bali pour continuer nos échanges, nos discussions, préparer des engagements et proposer des solutions. Il est plus que temps de transformer ensemble nos discours en réponses tangibles et concrètes. Pour cela, au Conseil mondial de l'eau, nous serons très attentifs à vos travaux et surtout à vos propositions. Merci à vous, et en particulier aux femmes et aux jeunes dont l'engagement est si nécessaire au futur de l'eau. Plein succès à vos travaux et à bientôt.
Thank you very much for that video message from the President of the World Water Council. Distinguished delegates, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this closes the opening session of this roundtable, but we'll now move into the first session before we take a break. The first session is to help us setting the scene by defining some specific challenges, opportunities for financing water investments in Africa, and the scale of financing, the capacities, to pave the way for regional solutions, African solutions, to resolve and find responses to address those challenges. For this session, we have 3 speakers. The first is Madam Fatoumata Toure Ibrahima Wane, the Water Practice Manager for West Africa from the World Bank. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. I'm going to maybe do my speech in English because I received the agenda in English. So at the last minute, I was wondering, should it be in French or English? But bear with me. So good morning and good afternoon to colleagues connected virtually. It's a real pleasure to participate in this 10th roundtable on financing water. I'm honored, actually, to be addressing you at this important gathering and setting the scene. It's not easy to set the scene after all these distinguished speakers. And I'm particularly honored to have had the opportunity to speak after His Honorable Minister of Water and Sanitation of Senegal. We've had this a couple of months ago, a good conversation on groundwater in Africa. So I think those insightful conversations would also be an input to this opening. And I would like to also thank the African Development Bank and the OECD for this invitation, hosting in Abidjan, and my co-panelists this morning. The World Bank is a member of the Roundtable for Financing Water since it was established. So the joint initiative of the OECD, the Government of Netherlands, and the World Water Council is very much welcome. I think you've heard today that we are not collectively on track to meet the SDGs. I think that's the main takeaway I have from the opening. The second takeaway I have from the opening is the multiplier effect that His Excellency has mentioned, which is critical. And the third, and I would like to insist on that one, is the sense of urgency to address the issues that we're facing given multiple crises. They are not just multiple crises, they are overlapping crises, which makes the whole agenda very challenging. So I was introduced before as the Water Practice Manager for Africa West, but I want to confess that I have a little bit of a bias because before getting into this position, I was the practice manager for PPPs for the World Bank. So the question of financing is something that is critically important for me. And you know, when you're surrounded by engineers who look at the installations and their durability, sometimes it's really important to discuss also the financial sustainability of the sector and the whole questions around how the utilities function and the weight on public financing. So recognizing really the richness of today's agenda, I would like to make 3 points. The first is very much related to the first session, which is on investing in water as a condition for prosperity of African economies. And we mentioned earlier the multiplying effect. The second, which I find extremely difficult, is the global value of water and the importance to leverage this precious resource to drive economies. Very often we focus on access and the access rates, and we forget to ask ourselves the question, where is the water is going to be coming from? So that question in my mind is fundamental. And I would like to applaud a number of countries represented here, including Cote d'Ivoire, Senegal, and others, that are thinking about a water security strategy to manage that particular question. And the third point that I would like to focus on is really the partnership, the public-private partnership agenda. And I would like to acknowledge also the presence of the IFC in this room as we work together to try to address this very important challenge. And from time to time, I want to think about public-private partnership as a proactive collaboration, given the sense of urgency that has been mentioned earlier. So on the first point, on water as a condition for prosperity of African economies, I think I'm going to again state the obvious, but I think it's worth it. Because access to reliable and sufficient water is critical, and we're having a challenge meeting that agenda. The adequate water resources will enable industries to operate efficiently. The agriculture element, I think that was mentioned earlier. Africa has such a vast agriculture potential, and how can we invest in water to benefit the agriculture sector of the African economies? Irrigation systems, water storage facilities, and wastewater. We've heard earlier a number of examples on sanitation. So the management and development of water resources need to be aligned with economic development strategies. And many countries are developing these strategies. What I would like to emphasize here is really the work that we are doing at the World Bank through what we call the country climate development reports, or CCDRs. And through that diagnostic, what we're trying to do is really to integrate climate and development considerations. Clearly, water is at the center of these conversations, and we are just finalizing one for Cote d'Ivoire. So they will help countries prioritize what are the impactful actions that reduce greenhouse emissions, but also boost adaptation. And we know that water is at the center of the adaptation agenda. So CCDRs identify the main pathways, but also the costs and challenging. So that's where we get into the financing element. The idea is to really suggest concrete priority actions. These reports are public, so they can inform all of us, including government, citizens, the private sector, and the development partners. This is a joint effort that we can do together. The World Bank cannot finance many of these huge investments, so we need to come together. So this brings me to the second point, which is how do we value it? How do we value water and biodiversity in Africa? And I think there is an important session on the agenda on that. As we discuss the management and development of water resources and its alignment with economic strategies, the next question is really the global value of water, the importance to leverage this precious resource to drive economic growth. As I mentioned, it's not easy because the global value of water is multidimensional, the concept that encompasses a wide range of factors. So this complexity, sometimes we need to unbundle it to have an idea of what we are really talking about, and I hope the session will help us answer the question. When we talk about the economic value, it's really understanding how water contributes to various economic activities. I think that's one of the maybe easiest one. The second, which is the overall economic output and the water as a commodity, implies a market value determined by supply and demand. And we know that that's much more complicated to do. So the value of water includes also the ecosystem services that it provides. So how do we go about it? How do we go about the value to biodiversity? The value of water includes the role of preventing waterborne diseases, and that was mentioned at some point this morning. Those different elements hold really an important component in how we define this value. We haven't mentioned necessarily how water holds cultural significance in many societies, how water, recognized as a basic human right, includes assurance of equity and equitability. So assessing the global value of water will require a holistic and integrated approach that considers these diverse factors and their interconnections. So this approach is essential to develop not only policies, but practices that promote the sustainable and equitable use of water resources worldwide. Water doesn't have frontiers. So at the World Bank, what we're trying to do as we speak is to develop what we call Global Challenge Program. The global community has very high expectations on how do we achieve a world free of poverty on a livable planet. So the livability of the planet is critical, and water is a huge component. So the Global Challenge Program has identified very urgent and issues that needs to be addressed in a very effective way in crowding both public and private solutions for financing. So with countries, we are working initially on 6 global challenge program. We call them GCPs. So you will be hearing more and more of that. And you wouldn't be surprised that the very first GCP mentioned is fast tracking water security and climate adaptation. So the link between water security and climate adaptation is critically important. But what I think is critical in this point is how do we fast track? So again, the sense of urgency. So all the GCPs, so water is one, but we also have energy transition, health, food and nutrition. And here you can see really the interrelations between water as a global challenge program, but its impact and interrelations with the others. So all these GCPs will benefit from additional support delivered with great speed, scale, and impact. So together with all the countries represented here, the idea is really to have those conversations and see how the World Bank is committed to working jointly with IBRD, of course, IDA, IFC, and MIGA, to make sure that these first 6 GCPs are really a success, and we can build on those. Now, let me go to the last point that I wanted to discuss this morning, which is the role of the public and private sectors and the need to continue to leverage private finance for water. We know that we have been at the, in the middle of multiple crises brought by climate change. So we know that 2.3 billion people lack access to safe water. 9 out of 10 natural disasters are water related. And floods, droughts could cause up to 5.6 trillion in cumulative losses to the global economy. So in this scenario, closing the investment gap is essential. The private sector has key role to play in bringing the financing gap and helping to achieve water-related sustainable development goals. Partnership and financing, as I mentioned earlier, we need a proactive collaboration. Water-related risks and implications for financial institutions in Africa are huge, but there are also opportunities to mitigate those risks. And I'm going to mention a couple of these risks that are very intuitive, but bring together, make it really challenging to address. So the physical risks that we see when we have water scarcity or flooding that can damage infrastructure, properties, and assets are something that financial institutions usually worry about. They worry about the changing of water regulations, the evolving regulations related to water use, discharge, pollution that can pose compliance risks for business affecting financial institutions. The reputational risks, and these are conversations that we often have around social and environmental concerns, including sometimes controversial investments. Credit and loan risks. So the water-intensive industries may lead to credit risk if these industries are adversely affected by scarcity or regulatory changes. Again, on financing sanitation, again, we can see also interesting risks related to that. So leveraging private finance for water will not necessarily be easy, but this is something that we need to address together. And very often we are asking ourselves, what is the magnitude? What are we talking about in terms of financing and contribution of the private sector? So what we're doing at the bank is to look at all the investment in infrastructure. Those include energy, transport, digital, and water. The private sector component of this investment represent about 13%. So more than 80% is public. So the role of the public sector is critically important. But when you zoom into the water sector, this number is even less, about 9% of private sector participation in water infrastructure. So we need to work together. According to the PPI database which we are working on, water projects represent only a small percentage of all this PPI investment for 2 reasons. The high input cost, which is not often mentioned in our conversations, the focus is very much on the low cost of recovery. But both are important and both represent a challenge in terms of how we bring the private sector into the conversation. So what we're trying to do at the World Bank, as I mentioned earlier, is to bring different instruments, IBRD, IDA, IFC, and MIGA, but also use some of our trust funds and other instruments to make sure that we are agile and flexible in the way we respond to some of your requests. So how do we bridge the gap for water investment gap? One of the points that was made earlier, which is to establish the enabling environment and necessary reforms to facilitate a greater flow of public and private finance, is critically important. So the role of governments continue to be key. International financial institutions, but also MDBs and the private sector. There is a say, and since I'm in Cote d'Ivoire, I'm going to use it, which is that if you want to eat an elephant, you'll have to cut it into pieces and eat it. You cannot eat it as whole. So that's how I feel very much when it comes to framing how we address private participation or private financing in the water sector. There needs to be a framework. So at the bank, what we're doing is really to try to bring a financing framework that allows the private sector to come more easily, or at least to have the right conversations, to have a roadmap on how we can work together. And we've had very good examples. For example, the first and second National Ganga River Basin project in India is a great one, where the bank has invested 400 million. IFC came as a transaction advisor and a mega guarantee. Same thing in Jordan. The Bitter Water project, for example, in Angola, was one of the first projects that allowed the use of IBRD guarantees. Blended finance of the Metro Manila wastewater management project is also another one. However, I want to mention that we have very interesting examples also on the continent. His Excellency has mentioned great examples of Senegal, where delegation of public services to private operators, as we call affermage, has brought a lot of results. For several decades, we've had a good partnership with countries like Senegal and others. But what I would like to really emphasize here is the upstream environment. Very often when we talk about financing and investment, we look at the transaction. The upstream environment work is critically important, and we need to very much focus on it. Jordan Water Sector Sustainability Roadmap. Personally, I like roadmaps because I think it gives a structure in how we get to the transactions. But examples in Senegal, in Benin, in other places in Africa are also very important. So I want to acknowledge the presence of our counterparts here on Benin, where we're working on a program for results to really continue to build the enabling environment. I mentioned earlier that only 9% of private participation. What would be the percentage when we talk about cross-boundary or trans-boundary water projects? Very little, almost negligible. So I would not want to close without really mentioning that this is an area where we need to work together. The World Bank has the Cooperation in International Waters in Africa. We call it SIWA. And we've just had our most recent annual meetings in Zimbabwe. And what we're trying to do with SIWA is really to work on transboundary water management, capacity building, infrastructure development, policy and institutional reforms, climate change adaptation, and community engagement. So we need that strong partnership to come together and work at the national level, but also at the regional and global level. So what I would like to finish with is that from Abidjan to Bali, we need to think about how we work with the elephant and how we can get to results. The multiplier effect, I would like to come back to it, His Excellency. The second is the upstream reform and really working on a roadmap to get to Bali and beyond. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Madam Fatoumata Wane. Very enriching and encouraging contribution, rich in content and a lot of important elements to unpack over the next 2 days here. I'll now invite Mr. Niels Vlaanderen from the Government of Netherlands. He's a Coordinator International Water Affairs at the Ministry of Infrastructure and Water Management to give his remarks. You have 10 minutes, please. Thank you.
Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for giving me this opportunity to also contribute to setting the scene. And of course, I'd like to build on the previous speaker. I think a lot of things, important things are already said, but I'd like to give my small contribution to this, setting the scene. This roundtable on financing water is not about attracting more finance. When we are truly convinced that water is a driver for sustainable development, then we should focus on the needs of improving the enabling environment, like also my colleague from the World Bank already brought forward. With this, to create the institutions, the policy instruments, the regulatory frameworks and funding required to sustainably manage our waters. To create the conditions so finance will flow to water and optimally contribute to the prosperity of our economies and well-being of our societies. To include the broader values of water into our decision-making and to take a holistic, integrated and long-term approach, taking into account the consequences of population growth, urbanization and effects of climate change. When we started this roundtable in 2017, we realized that water is complex and often not very well understood by the people taking decisions affecting water and those in the financial world. On the other side, people in the water sector know little about finance and how the financial sector works. Water-related investments deliver substantial benefits for water security and sustainable development. They refer to a broad range of investment that contribute to water security through the delivery of water and sanitation service, the management of water resources, and water-related risks. So too much, too little, and too polluted. Beyond the water sector, water-related investment connect multiple other sectors and policy agendas, including agriculture, energy, urban development, public health, and education. We learned that although investments in water make sense from an economic perspective, often this translates not into investments in water projects at scale. Lack of understanding the perceived risks and benefits leads to undervaluing of water resources and benefits associated with water investments by both public and private actors, limiting financing opportunities. Also, we learned that there are distinctive bottlenecks that hinder the mobilization of sources of finance to contribute to a water-secure future. These bottlenecks include a weak enabling environment, insufficiently robust strategic planning and prioritization, a lack of attractive risk-return profiles for specific projects, and the local small-scale nature of many investments. Water-related investment typically lack distinct revenue streams and assets that can be used as a collateral, given that such investments are usually part of a larger system for the delivery of water-related service and management of resources, lacking specific ring-fenced revenues. And this is why we are here, to discuss solutions to these problems. Let's now focus on Africa. The African continent is now the fastest growing economy in the world, with forecasted growth of 4 to 5% per year for the next 5 years. For perspective, in Europe, we are struggling to reach a 1% growth per year. Significant progress has already been made in closing the service gap in many African countries. Overall, in sub-Saharan Africa, the percentage of households with basic tap water increased from 45% in 2000 to 65% in 2022. The percentage of households with safely managed water is increased from 18 to 31%, and basic sanitation coverage increased from 25 to 35%. When we put this in historical perspective, this 22-year period led to the greatest increase in access to water services ever achieved, despite the continued population growth across the African continent. Jointly with other heads of state, our Prime Minister of the Netherlands, Mark Rutte, has taken part of the high-level panel for Africa Investment Programme. We took on the challenge to find the $30 billion a year needed to reach ambitious water and sanitation targets. The high-level panel launched at the UN 2023 Water Conference showed that most of the resources can be raised through domestic resource mobilization, increasing the efficiencies with the resources already being spent and promoting with water stewardship within industries that have high water uses and discharges. The expected growth the coming years is an opportunity for countries to improve and strengthen their enabling environment to work towards water security. Some elements I like to mention is the increase of public budget and allocation to water security, prioritize water security in national and continental agendas, and look into new sources of finance. And lastly, improve the access to finance. There are two areas I'd like to elaborate on. The first is the access to finance and where we need more discussion. And I hope we can have discussion in these 2 days. The role of the affordability of capital and the role of the MDBs. And I'd like to use the example of the Netherlands. Our regional water authorities are tasked with various services related to water security. And the funding of the service delivery of the regional water authorities is mostly coming from water taxes they collect. These taxes are linked to real estate property value, and collection rates are over 97%. Service delivery standards are high. Homes rarely flood, and all domestic wastewater is treated. The good services raise property values, which increases the tax base, which enables better service delivery from water authorities, a virtuous circle, in particular in major cities. These regional water authorities finance their investments through loans from the Bank of the Dutch Water Authorities. Because the risks are low, this bank is a AAA bank that can attract private capital from international money and capital markets at a competitive rate, mostly by issuing bonds. This bank lends their capital at an affordable rate of 1 to 2% over the past decade to the regional water authorities. The enabling environment is near perfect. What the MDBs, such as the African Development Bank and the World Bank, are for developing countries, the Water Authorities Bank is for the Netherlands, a source for affordable capital, with the distinction that the source of capital for the Netherlands Regional Water Authority is mostly privately financed, seeking long-term modest returns at the lowest possible risk. Nonetheless, the average debt of the 21 water authorities is somewhere around 300%, and for some as high as 500% of their annual budgets. Debt distress will increase in the coming decades, while the impact of climate change accelerates. investment needs will balloon and interest rates will rise. In spite of a near-perfect enabling environment, affordability of capital is essential in the Netherlands. It is even more essential in lower income countries where the enabling environment is much weaker. Now my second point is, this refers to the Global Commission on the Economics of Water. The importance to use a holistic and integrated approach beyond the standard economics. It is in its first report launched during the UN Water Conference in March this year. The Commission says, as the science and evidence show, we now face a systemic crisis that is both local and global. Water systems are used beyond their boundaries. It is time to value water better and more holistically. We will fail on climate if we do not solve water. We will fail on all the SDGs. One of the recommendations of the Global Commission on the Economics of Water is that we must cease underpricing water. Proper pricing with targeted support for the poor will enable water to be used more efficiently in every sector, more equitably in every population, and more sustainably both locally and globally. We must also account for water's non-economic value in decision making, to ensure we protect nature on which the planet and all life will depend. Now, why is this important? Already the lack of economic pricing of water services and regulation means that the cost of poor stewardship are externalized onto the public balance sheets for other uses. Governments need to signal water security as a national development priority, with water strongly represented in the institutional setup and mainstream through all water-using or water-affected sectors, including climate adaptation. Given the key connecting role that water and sanitation have in national economies and in social development, heads of state should ensure that water, security and sanitation are at the very front and center of all development and productive activities. Financial institutions should account for water-related risks that activities they finance are exposed to and reflect water risks in their pricing of capital, and by doing so contributing to water security. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Niels. And the last speaker for this session is Madame Yvonne Magawa. She is Executive Secretary for Eastern and Southern Africa Water Regulators Association, ESAWAS. Please, Madame, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chira. Good morning, everyone, and good day to all those who are joining online. His Excellency, Mr. Serene Thiam, Minister of Water and Sanitation, Senegal, I stand on the protocols that have already been established, and to thank you sincerely to the African Development Bank and OECD for inviting ESAWAS to speak at this very important discussion of financing for Africa, water and sanitation financing. Just to mention that ESAWAS is a network of water supply and sanitation regulators, so most of my remarks will be focusing on the enabling environment, as has been alluded to in the several speakers that have gone before me. So government has the ultimate responsibility for water supply and sanitation service delivery, and the water sector reforms, which were instituted from the 90s onwards in several countries across the continent, aimed to arrest and redress the deteriorating status of service provision. Yet without adequate, well-targeted and impactful funding, services retrogress, and they are retrogressing. And we will be back to a situation before reforms were even instituted. The issue of the sector being underfunded is and continues to be a very loud cry. This is in comparison to other sectors within the countries. So to illustrate, the percentage of government spend allocated to the water sector ranged from 2.2% in 2019, that is for Kenya, 4.1% in 2021, which was for Uganda, and 1.4% in 2022 for Zambia. And the percentage of GDP allocated to the water sector was far less than 1 for all these three countries, 0.5% as we heard from Mr. Chanda's presentation. We are now a little more than halfway through the SDG period, and there is urgent and pressing need to catalyze sector progress through meaningful actions to drive additional investment and support capital improvements. There is a tug of war between the human right to water and sanitation, as my colleague Sareen from civil society would say, versus charging. But this needs to take into consideration that a cost has been incurred to provide the service, and this cost needs to be covered or recovered. The ultimate price for poor services is paid for by the citizens. Poor services creates poor payers and a sector that lacks attractiveness for investment. So how do we address this? It requires regulation to professionalize the sector. The cost of establishing a regulator is far less than that of non-regulation. I must hasten to say that regulation is not a magic key, but it is a very powerful enabler to increasing investor confidence in the sector. Countries such as Tanzania, Kenya, Lesotho, Angola, just to name a few, have seen a marked increase in sector funding after establishment of an autonomous regulator. So the regulatory framework is the foundation for how all decisions that affect service providers are made, including the setting of tariffs. So effective regulation provides accountability, answerability by those who are mandated to provide the service, stability in being able to predict what will happen in the sector, credibility, the trust that is needed to be able to engage, predictability, knowing how decisions will be made, clear methodologies, transparency in how the sector is governed, and consistency of the sector in terms of the decisions that are made against an action. As we all know and have heard, private sector will only engage where they can predict a return on their investments. In Burkina Faso, government through ministerial decree put regulation on households for emptying of pit latrines. This provided the enabling environment for private sector to enter the market. In Senegal, Honorable Minister, the private sector in sanitation are advocating for strengthening of regulation because they are convinced that this will provide the enabling environment for them to be fully engaged in the sector. So effective regulation can be achieved with strong policy and legal frameworks that insulate the regulator from political interference. Some countries have not been able to adjust tariffs in years simply because government does not want to adjust tariffs. This risks the sustainability of the service providers and passes the burden back to government to close the financing gap. The regulator's task is to balance affordability and sustainability concerns. So the ability of the sector to recover costs and earn returns signals the overall strength that is guided by progressive increments in tariffs that cushion both the consumer and the provider. You can't make 100% tariff increase after 5 years. It is detrimental to the sector, to the consumer, to the provider. Small increments year to year keep the sector floating. However, I must also say that unlocking sector funding through regulation goes beyond tariff setting. It is the entire management of the sector financing framework and the strengthening of the regulatory role in this. Countries must develop sector investment plans supported by evidence and scenario analysis to guide and attract investments in the sector. It is very easy to say we need $20 million in the sector, but what is this based on? Who will be the beneficiaries? How will the quality of service change? Unfortunately, we do not have systems that tie the quantum of investment to resultant change in services. In fact, the AMCAO 2023 Goal Commitments Report shows that consolidated data on investments by year is simply not available in most countries across the continent. But how much have we invested in the sector, and what is the actual change in service provision? We cannot even account for this. We therefore need to invest in national level data infrastructure that can inform the status of the sector and investments needed right from the local level. How can we know what to address if we don't know where we are? We need to invest in systems. A case in point are the ministry-led information systems being developed in Zambia and Kenya, for example, that consolidate information from the entire sector into a single system to enhance decision-making. This includes information of all investments, even by global agencies in the sector. This will ensure efforts are well targeted and have the desired impact. Monitoring, tracking, and reporting on the status of the sector is a key regulatory function and should include linking investments to service delivery changes that promote transparency in sector interventions. Unlocking other funding options is also a very key interest of the regulator. This includes improving creditworthiness of utilities, as we've heard, through regulatory mechanisms. Favorable performance ratings through benchmarking indicates lower risk, and the utility can then benefit from lower borrowing costs and attract the needed investments to improve and expand service. The use of surcharges, basket funding, ring fencing, microfinance, commercial lending, sovereign loans, climate finance, and so on are all options available in a very well-regulated sector. So countries need to strengthen sector-wide approaches for WASH that bring sector actors to one platform to collectively address sector needs. This approach is yielding results in countries such as Namibia, which has coordination forums at national and local government levels. Zimbabwe has coordination committees at national, provincial, and district levels. Tanzania has the National Sanitation Campaign, strictly for sanitation, bringing all sector actors to one platform. Ethiopia, I'm sure you've heard of the One Wash National Program, and we also have examples from South Sudan as well, with national WSS committees. So partnerships in the sector, among sector actors, across sector ministries, even with civil society, academicians, are all important to be able to collectively drive the sector. Finally, the ultimate goal of regulation is universal access at a minimum acceptable quality of service. So leaving no one behind demands non-discrimination in service provision, whether it is marginalized, poor, informal settlements, rural, urban, off-grid, or in whatever form. Water and sanitation services are public goods with an economic value that must remain accessible and within reach of every individual, enforced through progressive targets set for the sector. This can be supported by good governance frameworks, strong sector coordination mechanisms at both subnational and national levels that very ably facilitate investment, that strengthen service resilience and promote progress under effective regulation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Madam Yvonne. A strong and credible regulatory framework is essential to attract financing for the sector. That's one takeaway I got from the last speaker. And with that, Your Excellency, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our first part of this morning. We will now break for tea for 20 minutes, and everybody should be back in the room at 11:10 to continue with our second session of this day. With that, I would like to thank Your Excellency and all the distinguished speakers this morning for a wonderful session, and would like to release you. Thank you very much. So tea and coffee are served just outside of the room. Please feel free to partake. Thank you.